Our deepest anxieties about the end of life stem from a single, unquestioned assumption. We believe our identity is entirely bound to our temporary physical bodies. Because of this profound identification with the physical form, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad observes that biological death is rarely a peaceful release for the unliberated mind. As the physical organs begin to fail, the vital forces, known as the pranas, detach from the physical vessel, severing the sensory connections that tie a person to the world. The departing consciousness violently resists this separation. The Upanishadic text compares this agonizing exit to a heavily loaded cart, creaking and groaning as it is dragged forward against its will. Unresolved desires and earthly attachments pull back against the transition, creating the agonizing friction heard in the creaks and groans of the cart. The agony of the transition measures the depth of our identification with the vehicle. We experience the disintegration of the physical form as the disintegration of our own being. The Upanishads present an even more uncomfortable reality. Waiting for the body to fail misses the point entirely. We are already undergoing a kind of death every single day. The texts describe the objects and desires of our waking world as mrityo rupani, literal forms of death. The senses operate on the persistent illusion that external objects provide lasting stability, though in reality, these pursuits empty the mind of its true strength. These objects sap our vital energy. They deplete our inherent power and leave the mind utterly fatigued. This endless loop of external craving and exhaustion binds human consciousness. The mind becomes so heavily conditioned by unfulfilled desires that it is forced back into the cycle of transmigration just to chase them again. To avoid the fate of the groaning cart, this cycle of depletion has to be broken. A very specific kind of death must take place long before the physical body fails. For millennia, seekers have retreated from the noise of the senses to examine the mechanics of their own awareness, moving away from external distraction into deep internal concentration. When the external world is finally silenced, they confront what Vedantic philosophy calls mula avidya, a deep-seated root ignorance residing in the heart that sustains the illusion of a separate, vulnerable self. This ignorance cannot be slowly chipped away. Its destruction is described as a sudden, total realization of our true nature as pure Brahman, striking like lightning through a pitch-black cavern. External light only reveals physical objects. This internal illumination dispels the very framework of the ego, exposing the boundary between the individual and the absolute as a complete fabrication. This realization destroys the framework of the ego, stripping away everything we falsely believed ourselves to be in a single, irreversible insight. Arriving at this flashpoint requires a surgical approach to internal investigation. Seekers use the active practice of neti-neti, meaning not this, to methodically separate the eternal self from the temporary mind-body complex. The Katha Upanishad provides a precise mechanical metaphor for this separation. Isolating the core identity from the physical vessel must be done as cleanly and unerringly as pulling a delicate stalk from a blade of munja grass. What makes this extraction so difficult are the hridaya granthi, the knots of the heart. These are the deeply ingrained psychological attachments and desires that physically bind the false ego to the body. When the ego operates on its own authority, asserting a false independence and claiming ownership over actions, the universal law of death takes possession of the senses through inevitable fatigue and decay. But when a seeker consciously identifies and discards these lurking desires, the ego loses its structural integrity. Deprived of its attachments, the false self simply dies. This deliberate psychological death defines moksha, or liberation. It shows how a mortal can step completely outside the cycle of suffering and achieve immortality in this world, right now. This brings us to the state of Jīvanmukti, the strange reality of being entirely free while continuing to exist inside a functioning physical body. The internal state of the Jīvanmukta undergoes a permanent shift. The texts describe them as perpetually calm, composed, and cool, entirely free from the doubts, fears, and anxieties that plague the ordinary mind. They perceive the world as a direct manifestation of the self, moving past the narrow perspective of objects as mere threats or sources of desire. They continue to work and act within society, yet because the self-affirming ego has been dismantled, their actions are utterly surrendered. They generate no psychological friction and leave no karmic residue behind. For the Jīvanmukta, the external world ceases to be a mechanism of suffering. It becomes a mirror, perfectly reflecting their own infinite nature. Eventually, the biological clock runs out. Even the physical body of a liberated master will succumb to natural failure, leading to the final stage of liberation. This departure shares nothing with the groaning, heavily loaded cart. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad compares it to a snake shedding its skin, a lifeless slough discarded effortlessly, leaving the creature completely unbound. The scriptural promise is absolute. The mortal who successfully banishes all desires from the heart becomes immortal, attaining Brahman in this very world. The consciousness of the liberated remains as the immortal life breath, radiance that is inherently free from the boundaries of travel or location. Like a river flowing steadily into the ocean, giving up its specific name and form entirely, the individual consciousness merges permanently into Brahman, the ultimate reality of existence, consciousness, and bliss. True freedom is the profound realization that anything you can possibly lose was never who you were to begin with. When the ego dies, death itself comes to an end.